Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started in just a second here, but wanted to give everyone a heads up that this presentation will be recorded. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you for being here. I'm Max Odkins with the Fire and Resource Assessment Program here at CAL FIRE. I'm excited to welcome you here to this presentation highlighting some research from one of the grantees in our Forest Health Research Program. We're joined today by Dr. Salli Dymond from Northern Arizona University for this presentation, Forest Management to Promote Resilient Coast Redwood Forests. This presentation is part of CAL FIRE's Forest Health Research Grant Program, which is in turn part of California Climate Investments, putting cap and trade dollars to work in communities throughout California. This program aims to prioritize and fund research in forest health and fire science critical to the state of California, share scientific information, and support statewide plans, including the California Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan. Before we get started, there's some quick housekeeping. As I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded, and the presentation recording will be posted on our webinars and events webpage. You can see the URL for that listed here, as well as a QR code to see both this recording once it's posted and recordings of all of our previous webinars as well. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so please go ahead and use the chat feature to enter your question at any point, and we'll ask it at the end of the presentation, or you can go ahead and use the raise hand feature if you prefer to get unmuted and ask your question out loud. Both of those will be available in the Q&A session. So with that, I will introduce our speaker today. Dr. Salli Dymond is an associate professor in the School of Forestry at Northern Arizona University. She holds a BS and MS in forestry from Virginia Tech and a PhD in Watershed Hydrology and Management from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. She is a forest ecohydrologist and is particularly interested in how trees interact with and exert control over the hydrologic cycle, especially following disturbance. She is currently board secretary of the Consortium of Universities for the Advancement of Hydrological Sciences. Thank you so much, Salli, for joining us. Please take it away.
Yeah, let's get this presentation up. It's thinking. There we go. Let me know when you can see that.
Yes, it's coming through just fine.
Wonderful. Yeah, thanks for that introduction, Max, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. This is my first time actually presenting on this project, so I'm really excited to be talking about it. And I'm the PI on the project, but like any large project, I do not undertake this large effort alone, so I want to first acknowledge my project team. And my co-PI on this project is Dr. Joe Wagenbrenner. He's a research hydrologist with the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station. He's based in Arcata. And the lead hydrologist at our research site is Anna Thompson, and she's also with the Forest Service. The person who does the bulk of this work on the project is my PhD student, Mairead Brogan. And we've also had 2 undergraduate students from NAU go out during the 2 different field seasons so far, CJ Hyatt and Monse Kahike. And we have a lot of help from CAL FIRE on the project. So our 2 primary collaborators are Drew Coe and Joe Restano. And then we also collaborate with Matthew Boone and Julie Rhodes. So a huge effort by our large project team. Having trouble, there we go. So we know that forest thinning is used to promote tree growth by decreasing competition for above ground and below ground resources. But what we're interested in this project is, can it enhance the resiliency of coast redwood forests? And we use the term resiliency a lot in management and particularly a lot in academia, but it can mean lots of different things. So what on earth do we mean by resiliency for this particular project? And we're interested in resilience for 2 main capacities for this project. And the first one is drought resilience. And we know that coast redwood forests grow in a really small niche environment along the California coast coastal climate, and up into Oregon a little bit as well. And so they're uniquely adapted to these small coastal forests that experience a lot of coastal fog, so along the coastal California fog belt. And the coastal California fog belt is experiencing some climate changes, just like a lot of different parts of the globe. And so we see evidence of increasing sea surface temperatures and increasing air temperatures along the coastal California Redwood belt. And there's a possibility of decreasing summertime fog events along this region. And some of this has been observed in certain parts of the coastal California Redwood Belt, and some of it is predicted to increase in this decline over time. And so there are plenty of concerns for what this decreasing fog might do for the coastal California redwoods. And part of this is because the California redwoods are very dependent on fog for their plant physiology. We know that they can undertake some really, really cool different things than other species. So they undertake foliar uptake, which means they can actually take in the fog water through their leaves. And it's one of the reasons that they grow so tall, right? They're the tallest trees on the planet. And so some of the things that we know about coast redwoods is that they decrease their water use during fog events. And we've seen this at our field site in California that we're working at right now. So here's some data by one of my former graduate students. And this was looking at the 2022 fog season. So we go from April to October, or beginning of October in this graph. And what she has on the y-axis here is sap flow velocity, so the rate of the movement of water in the trees. And the blue bars are rainfall events, but the gray bars are fog events. And so we found that transpiration was lower, the plant water use was lower during fog events, and it increased on sunny days. And this is really important because the trees are still allocating carbon, so they're still growing on these days, but they don't have to use as much soil water on these days because they can use that coastal fog water. Oop. Sorry, having problems clicking my slides. So coast redwood trees, this means that they don't have to utilize their soil water resources during these fog events. So what we also found at this field site is that we found evidence that they don't have to draw down their soil water resources. And so here I have a similar graph to what we had earlier, except now instead of the transpiration on the y-axis, we have daily changes in soil water. And so the zero line is just a flat zero. So when we go above the zero, it means that soil water was recharged. And when we go below that zero line, it means the plants were either using water or there's soil evaporation. And so unsurprisingly, during rain events, the soil water goes up. But during our fog events, the soil water wasn't really relied on at all by these trees. So we found that fog events depressed the use or the drawdown of soil water during the growing season. And this is really important because in the Mediterranean climate of the coastal California Redwood Belt, the water comes during the wet season. And so during that summer season, the soil water resources are limited. So if the redwood trees start using these soil water resources over time, it can deplete the soil water, and then it can lead to depressed growth, drought conditions, desiccant of the leaves, and also drier fuels. And so this gets us and connects us to the second resiliency question that we have in this project, which is fire resilience. And so this map right here is based on a study that was done by Park Williams, looking at historical fire frequency across the United States and relating it to current fire frequency. And so they were trying to see whether or not our current fire is more or less frequent than what the historical fire regime was. Then they characterized the California coast ranges as being in a fire deficit. So in other words, the the California North Coast has a current fire rotation around 100 years, and the observed fire, sorry about that. The expected fire rotation is 100 years. The observed fire rotation is almost 300 years. So this means we're not experiencing as much fire as we should be, and this is a potential buildup of fuels over time. And so we know that this fuels and the depth of fuels is related to forest management. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the things we do in forestry and forest management is to thin forests in order to get basal area growth, right? So here is a study on the Northern California coast looking at forest treatments and the relationship to tree growth as well as to fuel bed depth. And so this was utilizing two different treatments, a low thinning treatment and a localized release plot. And they were comparing, again, this basal area increment growth compared to the control plots. And if we look, we can see in redwood trees specifically, the basal area increment did increase following the localized release and the low thinning plots compared to the control. So again, what we would expect. Now, when we look at the trade-off though with fuels, you can see that there is a higher fuel bed depth following that treatment. Again, this makes sense. You're going in, you're removing boles of trees, but you're also leaving behind a lot of slash by that physical harvesting. So they found an increase in fuel bed depth following the treatment, but this was also significant in 4 years post-harvest, with the localized release having a higher fuel bed depth than the low thinning treatment. So we know there's a connection between this forest management and this fuel bed and potential fire resilience in these systems. So this gets back to our larger question of how can forest management to be used to promote forest resilience to drought and fire in the coast redwood region. So we have 3 primary project goals with this research. Our first goal is to investigate the role of current and past forest management on soil moisture and plant transpiration in coast redwood forests. Our second goal is to disentangle the combined impacts of thinning and drought on tree productivity. And then our third goal is to link harvest-induced changes in soil moisture and microclimate to fuel and fire behavior. And as I mentioned, this is my first time talking about this project in its entirety. But when I try to speak about this project to people, it really seems like we're connecting pretty disparate ideas into one really, really large project. So the way I've been explaining this is that we're taking a large ecohydrological framework and approach to the project. And I think, most natural resource managers know this, that everything is connected, but this is how I like to explain it. So in a typical forest system, we have trees on the landscape and they're connected with the soil. And in our Mediterranean climate, we have rains come in, and for the most part, they're coming in during our rainy season in the wintertime, and it restores our soil water resources and our groundwater, and everything fills up and the plants are nice and happy. And there is some growth and some transpiration that happens during the wintertime, but it's small compared to the rest of the growing season. And in these systems, the typical occurrence is to get summertime fog events. And so during the summertime fog events, there's still carbon allocation, there's still growth, but there is less of a reliance on that soil water pool that has to happen. And that soil water pool isn't getting refilled because there isn't much rain happening. And so the plants can grow, they can cool off, there isn't drying happening in the fuel bed or in the understory trees as well. And on warmer days, when after the fog burns off or when there's no fog, the trees are putting on carbon as well. They're growing, they're pumping out water, and they're reliant on that soil water as well. But everything is pretty stable. However, if you start to get no fog or periods without a lot of fog, you start drawing down those soil resources, and you're going to keep drawing them down. And if you have to draw them down a whole lot, what's going to happen is your leaves are going to start drying out. Your trees are going to get unhappy. The understory is going to get really unhappy. You're going to draw down your soil water very low, and you're going to start to dry out your fuel bed as well. And you can spark fire in the landscape as well. And so you can imagine that depending on your overstory conditions and your fuel conditions underneath, what might happen to the fire in the landscape is going to be really, really different. So we're interested in what the different forest types look like, what their age classes are, what their forest structure is, and what their fuel bed depth is, and how it's going to change some of these interactive effects of the drought on the plant water use and on the fuel drying out and on the fire dynamics, and whether or not we could use forest management to promote some of these more resilient ecosystems to both drought and corresponding fire effects. So this is the larger framework we're trying to think of it being a whole cycle within the system. Everything's connected and related. And so we have a really, really great place to study all of these effects. And we're using the Casper Creek experimental watersheds for this study. And the Casper Creek watersheds are located on the Jackson Demonstration State Forest, which is near Fort Bragg, which is actually where I'm sitting right now because we're doing field work for the project this week. So they're a few hours north of the Bay Area, and Casper Creek is a really cool study because it's a partnership between CAL FIRE and the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station. And so the Casper Creek, again, is nested in JDSF, and it's been studying the effects of forest management on watershed processes since the early 1960s. And there have been a lot of different experiments that have gone on in Casper Creek. There have been 3 major harvesting experiments, and I'm going to talk about a few of those. And they're situated in 2 really large watersheds, the North and the South Fork, and then some sub-watersheds in them. So Casper Creek, again, is in a Mediterranean climate, as I alluded to a little bit earlier. And so it's rainy. It gets about 46 inches of annual precipitation. And most of that, again, falls in the rainy season, which is about October to April. And mild monthly temperatures without a ton of fluctuation from winter to summer. And it's the California coast ranges. So mountainous, it goes up to just over 1,000 feet in elevation. Very, very steep slopes that are highly erodible and well-drained loamy soils. And they're very fertile, productive sites that support, again, coast redwood trees and Douglas fir forests. So as I mentioned, there have been a bunch of experimental harvests that have gone on at the site, which allow us to have a really great study design for this project. And so one of the studies that we're using is the North Fork experiment. And this, the harvesting for this one happened in 1985 to 1992. And so within the North Fork, they had smaller sub-watersheds, and they clear-cut harvested 5 of these sub-watersheds, again from 89 to 92. And they left 3 unharvested watersheds in the larger North Fork. And these unharvested watersheds were last harvested in the late 1800s. I want to say it was 1860s when these were last harvested by bull teams, as most of the northern coast was harvested. And then the clear-cut harvests had some pre-commercial thinning in 2001 as well. And so this sets up a really nice contrast of stand structure. And we're utilizing 2 of these different watersheds for this study. So we have the Hen watershed, which was unharvested in experiment 2. So again, this was last harvested in the late 1800s. And we're calling this a late cereal stage, although we've had some discussions about that. But this has high basal area, very park-like to walk through, kind of low trees per acre. And then we have Kepler, which was clear cut with some pre-commercial thinning, which is very, very overstocked, a dense thicket to walk through, and a lot of small diameter trees. The other study we're utilizing is the South Fork experiment. And this experiment we're sort of calling done, although we're still monitoring this study somewhat extensively. But this was officially set up in 2001. And this has two unharvested watersheds within the larger South Fork watershed. And these unharvested watersheds in the South Fork experiment were last harvested in the 1970s. So these are much younger forests. And in the 1970s, they received about a 2/3 basal area selection harvest. And that selection harvest was, again, a selection harvest of the forest that was harvested in the 1860s. For the remaining 6 watersheds in the South Fork study, they were harvested using multiple silvicultural approaches. And that's because we started at a 25% reduction in pretreatment basal area. And then we moved incrementally and 10% reductions up to a 75% reduction in pretreatment basal area. And the purpose of the study was to look at increasing levels of basal area removal on stream flow and watershed processes. So that's why we have that study design. And so the silvicultural prescriptions were pretty different depending on what watershed you were in. And these were harvested, all of the subwatersheds were harvested in 2017. And so again, this sets up watersheds with really, really different sand structure for us to look at the study objectives in this study. So we're utilizing 4 watersheds from the South Fork experiment for this study. We have the Will watershed in the upper right-hand corner. That was a control watershed, so it had no harvesting. So it has a higher basal area. I think it's our second highest basal area in the study. We have the Treat watershed that was a 35% prescription, but got 39% reduction. And the Uke watershed, which was 45%, got 46, so nice and close. Actually, yeah, it was. And those actually ended up with pretty similar overall basal area for the post-harvest treatments. And then you can see the Zemer watershed, and that is our highest harvested watershed. It's parts of it are pretty much a clear cut. So we have pretty low basal area in that watershed. So again, we have between these different experiments, we have 6 study watersheds that we're using for this study. They're all pretty much north-facing slopes, and we have range of basal area, trees per acre, and leaf area index. So we're looking at lots of different stand structure and metrics for competition and so forth. And we're still trying to quantify some of these for our different study objectives. And here are some photos that we have of the sites looking at effective leaf area and hemispherical photos. And our hemispherical photos aren't throughout the entire watersheds. They're just at a subset of our sites, but it gives you a little bit of idea of the canopy closure at some of these sites. So within this study design, we have our 3 different project goals that are nested within this larger study design. So our first project goal is, how does forest management affect our soil moisture and transpiration in these forests? So to do this, we're calling this the plant soil water study. We instrumented 6 trees at each of our 6 study sites, and we're along a kind of a mid-slope or topographic position for these instrumented trees. And we installed these in summer 2024. We installed sap flux sensors by Implex, and we instrumented 3 coast redwoods and 3 Douglas fir trees with these sensors. And if you're not familiar with sap flux sensors, we basically install needles into the tree, and the middle needle is a heater needle, so it sends out a pulse of heat. And then the temperature, the needles above and below that heater needle are temperature probes. And we look at the temperature difference between that heater needle and the above and below down probes. And we can back that out to the rate of the movement of water or sap in the tree. So that gives us a metric of plant transpiration. And then the data take a lot of time to process and to look at and to back out the calculations. But for this project, we're looking at that average daytime sap flux. Coast redwood does what we call reverse sap flow, so it'll actually move sap downward at night. And so we're looking at daytime sap flow between the hours of 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. We are also monitoring soil moisture. So we have these Campbell probes. So you can see this probe here, which is before we're putting it into the soil. And this gives us a really, really good depth integrated profile of soil moisture. So you can see all of our depths there. We get lots of different depths from 5 to 100 centimeters down in the soil. And we collect these again at 15-minute intervals, which is the same time interval that we're getting for that sap flow sensor. We also get microclimate measurements beneath the canopy at each of these sites. So all the sensors are located pretty close to each other. We get air temperature, relative humidity, wind speed. I think we're also getting photosynthetically active radiation, and we can back out and get vapor pressure deficit from these sites as well. We have larger meteorological stations located on the forest that give us some other weather data as well. And you saw some photos earlier, but we also get our hemispherical photos, and those have been collected in the 2 years of data that we have so far in the study, 24 and 2025. We do these using a pretty standard technique, using a fisheye lens on an SLR camera. And we do these 4 measurements per site in our cardinal directions, and we do those pre-dawn to reduce the sun angle effects. So we have good coverage around our sites, but again, not great watershed coverage to quantify, especially in some of our watersheds. We have great spatial variability. And those are processed in a hemisphere, and we get the effective and actual LAI, the effective accounting for some of that clumping and branch angle effects on leaf area index. So some of our preliminary data, Marie's been working through and processing a lot of the data. So these are her figures that I'm showing. This is data from August 2024, and I hope this is not too small on your screens. But what we have is the date on the x-axis. So that's, again, just 1 month of data from summertime, which is all the summer we have from 2024 based on when we got the probes in. On the left-hand y-axis is that average daytime sap flux. And so that's a volume of water per basal area of sapwood area per hour. So it's still just think of it as a rate of water movement in that tree. The blue lines are the individual Douglas fir trees per site, and the red lines are the individual coast redwood trees per site. And then they're paneled by site by increasing leaf area index. So lower to higher leaf area index. And then there's a secondary y-axis on that, and that secondary y-axis is vapor pressure deficit, and vapor pressure deficit is that thicker gray bar that you see. And 2 big things that you can probably see right away is that, one, there's variability between the different trees. So some trees are moving lower amounts of sap, and some trees are just moving more sap. And two, they track really well with the vapor pressure deficit. So when vapor pressure deficit is low, most of the trees reduce their sap flow. And when vapor pressure deficit increases, most of them are increasing their sap flow. And so we do find that there's a tight relationship between this sap flow and vapor pressure deficit. The interesting thing we found is that this relationship stays really tight depending on the leaf area index. So it doesn't appear that these relationships are changing based on leaf area index. So there's no interactive effect of leaf area index. They're all responding the same, and there's no species level difference as well. Douglas fir and coast redwood are responding the same. These are now data from May to June 2025, so the July and August haven't been processed yet. And the data are squished together because it's more time on the x-axis here. But it's pretty much the same story here. However, that the rate of sap flow increase per vapor pressure increase is a little bit lower than it was in August. I would anticipate that we'll see that August increase, the sap flow will move higher in August of this year as well, just because August is drier and we'll probably move more water in August than we would in May and June, which are foggier months here. And still, no difference between Douglas fir and coast redwood, and leaf area index has no interaction between vapor pressure and sap flow here as well. So it seems to be a vapor pressure story rather than a leaf area story so far. Here, the data are grouped by species and by increasing leaf area index here. And just a few things to note is that generally for August 2024, you can visually see that Doug fir had higher sap flow rates than coast redwood. This wasn't statistically significant. Again, we don't have a lot of trees. Sap flow is very expensive and again, labor intensive to process, but it's just interesting to note. And again, no relationship between leaf area index and sap flow rates. The next graph is difficult to see because we can have one Douglas fir that appears to be moving a lot of water. And I've asked Mairead about this, and we have reason to believe it might be real, but she's still looking into it and we're getting some other opinions on it. But still no relationship between LAI and sap flow rates. But here the Douglas fir and the redwood seem to have more similar rates, and they are not statistically different from one another. So we haven't yet looked at the relationship between soil moisture and sap flow rates, but for now we know that it doesn't appear that leaf area index has a relationship between transpiration and sap flow. So the next project goal is to look at the impacts of thinning on tree productivity and water use efficiency. And this is, I hope, my most boring slide, but we're looking at the relationship of carbon isotopes in our different plots for this one. And essentially, the bulk of the important thing to note here is that when trees are water stressed, the carbon isotope ratio changes, and this gets transferred to the woody cellulose in the plant, which allows us to look at tree ring signals for this study. And we're interested in whether forest harvesting alters this carbon isotope discrimination, or this carbon isotope ratio, C13 to C12 in the plant in coast redwood and Douglas fir trees. And we can look at this based on something called water use efficiency, which we can back out from this carbon isotope ratio. And water use efficiency is just essentially a metric of how much water is being lost by the plant per how much water is getting gained by that plant. And we're really interested in whether or not this allocation between water lost and carbon gained can help us understand the effect of management on drought resilience, right? If you're losing and relying on less water, but putting on more carbon, that's a big benefit to the ecosystem, particularly if we're going to experience more drought. So the way we're looking at this is, again, 6 trees at each of the 6 study sites. So still 3 coast redwood and 3 Douglas fir. And we're doing this using tree cores. And so 5-millimeter cores were collected for dating the trees, and 12-millimeter fat cores were used for destructive sampling. So to get the carbon isotopes, you have to physically cut up the core. And these cores were collected this past summer. And we use pretty standard dendrochronological techniques to date the cores. So they were prepped and sanded, and I think all of them have been prepped and sanded, and now they're being dated using WinDendro software. The larger cores, which you can see a larger core up above the smaller cores, they need to be prepped in a different manner because we can't cross-contaminate any of the sawdust between our cores, between our rings. So they're prepped using a microtome. And then we're subsetting our rings into 5 pre and post harvest years per sample. And we're doing this pre and post harvest so we can look at the harvesting effects. And we'll do that same thing even though some of our North Fork sites weren't actually harvested. So those will be a little bit of a control for us. And then basically we take those subset rings and we mill them down into a fine powder, and then we can put them on our carbon isotope mass spec, or a mass spec for our carbon isotope analysis. And we're hoping to have all those cores ready to go on the mass spec by the end of the fall, and it's pretty quick to get the data back, so we should be able to start that analysis. By we, I mean my graduate student who will do that analysis this winter. And so again, those carbon isotope values will help us back out water use efficiency, and then we'll also get the basal area increment from the cores, which will be very useful as well to look at that productivity pre and post harvest and across the sites. So the last study that we have, our fuel moisture, soil moisture study, is looking at how do harvest-induced changes in soil moisture and microclimate affect fuel and fire behavior characteristics. And this is actually a picture from a small fire that was in our study site 2 weeks ago, I want to say, 1.6 acre fire that broke out and was put out very rapidly. And I did want to give a little bit of a background for this study in particular, because this is relatively new ideas and kind of pushing forward on some soil moisture, fuel moisture stuff and new stuff that's coming out in the literature. So we know that redwood forests can have high slash and fuel loads, and here's study that's come out looking at fuel slash loads, and particularly in redwood forests in Mendocino and Humboldt County. And you can see up top in the red box that I put up there that there are high slash depths and high fuels for these ecosystems. And we know that there's a strong interaction, again, between these harvesting practices and fuel loading and water dynamics in these ecosystems. And these are 2 different plots, understory sampling plots that we have in 2 different forest harvesting treatments that we've been sampling out at Casper Creek. And you can see the different fuel depths, you can see the different revegetation, and you can imagine the different moisture content at different times of years in these different plots. And some of the things that have been talked about recently are that current US fire indices don't incorporate great metrics of soil moisture and plant water stress. And so the fire danger rating systems don't use measured soil moisture. They rely on pretty coarse drought indices. And those drought indices don't use variables that are pretty important to the soil hydrology community, such as soil texture, which is really, really important for getting that soil moisture correct. and they don't account for that overlying plant stress vegetation. We also rely a lot on weather observations and variables that are in open environments. And when you get under different forest canopies, you really change those moisture metrics a lot. And that matters a lot for thinking about that fuel drying. And another thing is that we have a lot better technology now for measuring soil moisture and getting it back to offices than we used to. And so here's a study showing some relationship between what they called fractional available water capacity, or FAW, and they called this just as describing the thresholds at which these live grassland fuels were transitioning to dead fuels. And this was a study that was undertaken in Oklahoma. And they found that as this fractional available water in both the plants and the soils declined, the soils and the fuels were drying out. And you can see this along this probabilistic curve and these different gray bars, these transitions between fuel moisture beginning to decline, and as your environmental water starts to get lower and lower, you're decreasing your transpiration, and then all of a sudden you're wilting your plants, and all of a sudden everything in the ecosystem is drying out, and your wildfire probability is greatly increasing and is related to all of these different metrics that are based on moisture. And so the probability of large wildfires is really tightly coupled with that drought and that vegetation stress. And there was even a more recent paper that came out, and this came out like a month ago. And this is showing that soil moisture and plant hydraulic stress, which they called conductance loss, but this is really just the stress of the plant, how water stressed it is, were dominant predictors of fire spread. And I put this red box around the figure that's showing this. And basically, you can see that when soil moisture is low and plant water stress, which water stress is higher when the numbers are higher here, you can see that the red increases, and that red is hectares of wildfire. And so you can see that that's proportionally much higher. So low soil moisture, high plant stress, more fire. And these were greater predictors than some of the other variables, such as wind speed and even some of the fuel moisture. And so they found that incorporating these variables increased their model accuracy over fire spread. And so there are large arguments and calls for adding soil moisture into some of these fire behavior, fire spread models. And so this is some of the impetus for our study, which is looking at soil moisture and fuel moisture relationships and dynamics. And part of the reason we're doing this is because we have really long-term observations of soil moisture and some plant water dynamics at our study sites. So to do this, we are using heavy time-intensive measurements as well as some spatial measurements. So our time-intensive measurements are using Campbell Scientific 10-hour continuous fuel moisture sticks. So we have these at essentially a foot off the ground and at ground level. And these collect data every 15 minutes. And these are located next to all of our sap flow sensors. And then we also have one located on a ridgetop site. And again, they're right next to our soil moisture sensors and our microclimate stations. So we're getting all of our necessary weather variables and soil moisture variables right next to these fuel moisture sticks. So we get really great time-intensive data with these. Since these are small fuels, we are also getting some of our larger fuels using gravimetric methods at these sites. So again, we have 2 sites in our stick study watersheds for a total of 12 sites. We have downed and elevated samples that we put on the plots, and we have 100 and 1,000-hour fuels that get measured approximately monthly by the Casper Creek field crew when they're out monitoring the sites. So again, we don't get great spatial representation by this study design. So we are also doing spatially intensive sampling. And that is why I'm in Fort Bragg right now, because we're in a pretty serious field campaign to undergo spatial sampling right now. So we did a very preliminary sample in spring of 2025, trying to figure out how many plots we needed. But now we're doing our fall sampling campaign, and we're getting 10 plots across each of our 6 study watersheds. And we're doing gravimetric fuel sampling to get 1, 10, and 100-hour fuels. And then we're getting volumetric water content in concentric circles. So we're getting 1 meter circle around our plots, 5 meter circles around our plots, and then 10 meter circles around our plots to try to capture spatial variability. And we're doing plot photos to get canopy closure, and we're doing kestrel temperature, RH measurements, and basal area as well. So we're getting all of this done this week. Hopefully we'll be done midday tomorrow. We haven't done really much data analysis with this at all. I did want to throw up a few plots for you. So I have one plot on our time series data. So here's our late cereal site and our highly harvested site, looking at the fuel moisture sticks. And these are our ground-based sticks in the blue line. And you can see the percent on the left axis, our 5 centimeter volumetric water content on the right-hand y-axis, and that's in the red line. And you can see the pretty strong soil moisture drawdown. It's going to take some pretty complicated time series analysis to work with these data. These are backed up to a 10-minute or to a 1-day average, even though they're collected at 15-minute data. So we're going to have to think carefully how we do these time series statistics with these really finely collected data. Some preliminary data on what was collected out at our preliminary sample. We didn't do the gravimetric data collection for the fuel moisture at the preliminary data collection that was just looking at fuel composition in the springtime. But these are some data. So looking at basal area across the sites, we found that higher basal area, there was a lower fuel bed depth. And these were the average plots. And then these are the 6 plots per watershed. So again, we'll take these with a little bit of a grain of salt. And then the higher trees per acre, we had a higher litter depth here. But looking forward to looking at the data that we collected this week. So what's next? Oh, get my slide to go. What's next? We have a lot of data collection going on, a lot of data in. We are continuing to monitor our plots and process data. We're about 2 years into what will be a 5-year project, but really 4 years of hardcore data analysis. We'll hopefully do another 1 to 2 spatial sampling campaigns of fuels and fuel moisture. So I look forward to doing another talk probably in 2 years of talking about all of the results and the insights and things we've learned from the project. So there are lots and lots of people, of course, to thank on the project. I mentioned our collaborators, but we have a lot of people from the Forest Service that help out and monitor our sensors and download data for us. All of the people, CAL FIRE has shown up with a huge crew this week to assist and have lots of teams out collecting fuels right now. I left my crew early today to come give this talk, but incredibly grateful to all of them for being out and hiking over Slash for us to collect fuels in the woods. And then Mike Jones from UC Berkeley has been really helpful for offering his assistance and his expertise on some of the fuel sampling. And also, thank you so much for the funding, the Forest Health Research Program for this funding. It has been an awesome project, and so grateful for the partnership with CAL FIRE. For the past 12 years, I've been working with them on JDSF. It's been great partnership, and looking forward to hopefully providing some insightful data that helps inform some of their management. So with that, I will say thank you very much for being here, and happy to take any questions, have a discussion, any insights you all have as we're partway into the project.
Perfect. Thank you so much again, once more, Dr. Dymond, for coming and presenting your project here with us. We are going to transition over to Q&A, and before I do that, let me just go ahead and stop the recording. This is a reminder that anyone who has a question, you can enter it in the chat or use your raise hand feature, and we'll get through as many questions as we have time for.